And for those of you just joining in, we're going to give it a couple minutes here before we get started. It takes like 2 minutes for everyone to get admitted into the room. So I see people trickling in right now. So we'll get started in just a minute here. And you'll probably hear me repeat this a couple of times. And again, for those of you just again, how we know that is if I look inside this code again, one of the attributes of an area for a object we created, if we translate it from or convert it from decimal to hexadecimal, look what it becomes: 42424242. Again, I know that's a little bit confusing or complicated, but it just shows us that we were able to get something that we control into an area of memory that we should not have been able to. And we're bypassing the mitigation, isolated heap, and deferred free, which is pretty neat. So each of these mitigations have ways around them. We just got to figure out how to do it and how hard it is. The more of these mitigations you combine together, the harder it is for an attacker to actually be able to bypass any of this. It's hard, but you can make it harder by implementing more and more of these mitigations. So control flow guard, real quickly, it focuses on indirection based attacks. Like if I write up a instruction here, you might see an instruction that says something like call and then double word. Actually, let me do this in a text box because my handwriting is terrible. Let me put this in a text box. So if you see something like call, double word, pointer, and then something like DS RAX, something like that. What that's doing is we're calling a memory address that's been loaded into a register. That is indirection. Where did we get this address is the question. That's why it's called indirection. From where did we get the address that's loaded into the RAX register? So what the mitigation does, which is called control flow guard, is it validates that the address that we're going to call, which should be a function, is in an area of memory that includes function entry points. There's something called a bitmap that's created. And think of the bitmap as looking like a chessboard or a tic-tac-toe board. And there's all these different blocks which represent blocks of memory. And as long as the address that we're going to call is in a block of memory in the chessboard that includes valid function entry points, we'll let it continue. Otherwise, we won't. And that really focuses on indirection-based attacks and tries to prevent return-oriented programming from being a viable technique for attackers. Control flow integrity, a lot of these are going to overlap with some of the kernel stuff I'm going to skim through here soon. Control flow integrity and control flow enforcement technology, these are trying to stop two things. One, return-oriented programming, and two, buffer overflows. Buffer overflows should have been mitigated decades ago. The things that you could do in 1995, you can still do today in 2022. That's kind of crazy if you think about it. But these mitigations here actually, for once and for all, greatly limit and mitigate that bug class. Stack-based overflows, buffer overflows, and return-oriented programming is greatly mitigated by these controls. But they only work on processors that support it, like Intel Tiger Lake CPUs, which are very new. Most of us don't have those. and the operating system needs to support it. And you need to go turn it on. If we go back over to this Windows 10 system real quickly, I think if we go to the very bottom here, no, it's not there. Maybe it's in the main area here. Let me see. Let's go under system settings, go to the bottom. No, this is a different version of Windows than I was expecting. Let me see if it's there real quick though. I'm checking to see if the shadow stack stuff and control flow enforcement technology is here. And it's not on this system, but it is on some systems where it basically says that that version of the operating system supports it. So not only does the processor need to support it, also the operating system, and also you need to turn it on, which is pretty neat. This is a quick reference that just shows you the various mitigations that we talked about and a quick description and the effectiveness over on the right. So let's quickly talk about some kernel stuff because we only got about 10 minutes left and I'm scared as to how we're going to get through this. So kernel mode code signing. Some of these are easy to talk about because we already talked about a lot of mitigations. So kernel mode code signing. This one basically says that in order to be a driver, and drivers is code that talks to hardware, like your sound card and things like that. In order to be a driver that's loaded into memory, in kernel memory, you have to be signed by Microsoft. And if you're not, you can't be loaded. The bad side of it is if there's a vulnerability that's discovered in a driver that Microsoft did sign at some point, it can still be loaded. There's no revocation list for that. But it greatly limits the ability for attackers to write a malicious driver and get it loaded onto your system, which is a really good thing. It used to be that third parties could sign drivers on behalf of Microsoft. You can't do that anymore. Also, we can get even more strict, and Microsoft requires that if you want your driver signed, you have to submit it to them, and they go through these hardware quality labs. They validate from a code perspective that it doesn't have vulnerabilities in it, that it's coded properly. It's not a perfect process, but it's way better than it used to be, and it limits the number of drivers that can load into the kernel. SMEP and SMAP, that's supervisor mode execution and access prevention. What these controls are doing is preventing code execution from occurring in a user land memory address while under the context of the kernel. In other words, if we're doing something privileged in ring 0 in kernel land, if the address where code execution is supposed to take place is in user land memory, we won't do it because those pages are marked with a bit that says whether or not that page of memory is owned by the kernel or user land. Same thing with access protection or prevention. We're trying to prevent reads and writes and execution from occurring in an untrusted area of memory while in supervisor mode. There are ways around these mitigations by flipping bits in control registers or flags registers. If you know where they are, specifically the 21st and 20th bits in the E-flags register, if you can flip those bits while you're attacking, you can turn this mitigation on or off, but it adds another layer of complexity, and it's a good protection. Kernel address space layout randomization. So remember earlier when I was saying how attackers target the low-hanging fruit. Wherever it's easy is where I'm going to go. But if we attack an area so much that we start putting a lot of mitigations and protections and basically policemen at that location, then attackers are going to move somewhere else. So it used to be that attacking applications running in user land was the easy way to go. but so many mitigations and protections have been added into userland that it began to be easier for attackers to attack the kernel. So all those mitigations that we put into userland are now inside the kernel. So randomization that I already talked about is there. High entropy ASLR, making it difficult to find things like the location of drivers or the kernel base address, or also removing pointers or structures in memory that we used to be able to query to find out the location of something, moving that, making it so you can't, because there are structures in memory, kernel objects in memory that we could reliably query and we could get the location of something. We've removed that and made it harder. Segment heap. So in userland, there was something called the low fragmentation heap that was implemented primarily with Windows Vista. Well, go further down into the future, and what they decided to do, Microsoft decided to do, was implement the low fragmentation heap and something called the segment heap that was running in userland in the kernel. It's used for dynamic memory allocations, and it's a much better protected memory manager. So randomization of allocations is much stronger. There is chunk encoding. So we basically act like a canary and we XOR these special values against the metadata of chunk allocations in the kernel pools to protect it. So again, things like guard pages, random allocations, chunk encoding are all the protections that come in with things like the segment heap. So dynamic memory in the kernel is better protected. Control flow guard, we already talked about that. And I drew up an example like this where we're saying call, like where's an example here? Down at the bottom, call guard dispatch icall. That's a check to go and validate that the memory address that we're going to go to is in fact a valid function entry point. So we're doing that in the kernel now as well, and not just in userland. So control flow guard, like in userland, but in the kernel. Patch guard, I explained this a little bit as well. In basically indirection. Malware like rootkits and attackers exploits, it's very common for us to overwrite pointers in memory that are relied upon. Let me give you an example. Like, let's say an application wants to allocate memory. On Windows, it's going to call something called heap alloc. That's the function, heap alloc. Well, if I overwrite the pointer to where heap alloc is supposed to reside with attacker code, then I've basically patched that. I've hijacked that. I've taken it over. And so an attacker can get code execution. So what patch guard does is it makes it so you can't overwrite critical areas of memory in the kernel, especially those that support indirection or critical structures or where pointers reside. How do we guard it? Well, we can change the permission to be read-only. You can't write there. Or we can do some integrity check and validate via a checksum or some type of cryptographic check and validate that it hasn't been modified. So patch guard prevents critical structures in the kernel memory from being overwritten, from being modified. VBS, virtualization-based security, is fascinating. If you've heard of Credential Guard basically takes the LSAS process, which is a local security authority subsystem. If you've ever used a tool like Mimikatz to inject into the LSAS process and steal credentials, VBS stops you from being able to do that. Credential Guard uses VBS, and this diagram helps explain it more. Basically, instead of what you see on the right, which is normal userland and normal kernel land, we use Hyper-V. So we insert a hypervisor there. And we have our normal kernel and our normal user land. But see how the LSASS process is up there, lsas.exe? In user land with credential guard on and VBS on, that's not really LSASS. There's nothing in there. LSASS really resides over in what you see as VTL1, this virtual distrusted level 1, as an isolated user mode process called LSA ISO. Basically, it's virtualization-based security. It's a separate virtual machine with a secure, stripped-down kernel instance that hosts as an isolated user mode process an instance of the LSASS process that's encrypted. So if you try to run Mimikatz, you're over here in VTL0 and you're injecting into an empty process. The real credentials are over in a secure kernel instance as an isolated process called LSA ISO. It's amazing protection. And it works with device guard, credential guard, like all of this comes together and uses hypervisors to implement sandboxed environments through virtualization. If we get to a point where every application and service is running as an isolated user mode process, life is going to be very hard for an attacker. So credential guard, as I explained, is one example of that, which also gets into hypervisor code integrity, which basically says we can do something called code signing. We can not only sign a driver, we can sign blocks of code and say, before code execution can continue in this area in the kernel, it must be signed. And if it's been compromised, if someone overwrote it, terminate the process. You can't execute code there. So it's all this virtualization-based security and code signing that's running to allow for virtualization-based security attacks to be very difficult. The trust is placed in the hypervisor. So really your only attack target would be the hypervisor itself or the broker in between these different protected areas. The attack surface is greatly reduced. So we can go after the brokers and the RPC channels, the hypervisor, the firmware, and do things early on in the boot process. But even those things are better protected. And then we get even further into HyperGuard, and we do the same thing as we do to kernel code blocks, but from a hypervisor perspective. So you can see I'm going rather quickly because we're at the end of time. But all this stuff works together. It's quite complex. It's getting really hard. And that's why the value of this stuff is getting so high. I'll show you this real quick. I'm not advocating for this company at all, but this is Zerodium, and they buy exploits. And you can see they'll pay up to $1 million for Windows remote code execution bugs in the kernel, or they'll pay up to $2.5 million for Android and iOS exploits. My point being, yes, it's harder, but the price tags, how much they'll pay for this stuff is way up high. You get into newer mitigations like extended flow guard, which means we can go in to look at like function prototype data and make sure not only is the address a valid function entry point, but does that really look like a function? Or has an attacker modified something or redirected us somewhere harmful? And continuing down the path of shadow stacks and control flow enforcement technology, focusing more on the bootloading process and early on, and the hypervisor. So this stuff gets just quite fascinating. We are at the end. I'm sorry that I ran a couple minutes over here. I had a feeling it was going to happen because I always try to cram too much information into a presentation, but I hope that you found some value in it and you kind of see what's currently going on with a lot of these mitigations and how hard it is for attackers. But you have to, as an administrator, make sure that you turn this stuff on and that you test it so that it doesn't negatively impact your applications. And I'll ask there real quick, as far as Q&A, I don't see anything. I see one question asking, what's the picture on my wall? That's a Dave McKeon print. He's a famous artist out there. Thanks for asking. But I don't see any other questions, which I guess is a good thing because we're at the end of time. But I'll hang out for a couple of minutes in case someone has a question. Otherwise, I don't know if anyone from SANS has anything they want to say, but I'll hang out here for a couple minutes. Can we get a PowerPoint? So we will be posting up the PDF of these slides, and you can go back and listen to it, of course. So absolutely, good question. But yeah, if you have any questions, post them. Where will the recording? I think if you go back to where you signed up for this presentation, that's usually where it goes. That's usually where it is. Yeah, so somebody just said none of this is documented. I'd expect. How long did it take? So Microsoft has gotten better about documenting a lot of this stuff. I agree. They used to be terrible about it, but they have done a couple good presentations at the Blue Hat talks. But yeah, a lot of this is native information, undocumented information that researchers go in and just share the knowledge, which is great. Oh, thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. Yeah, so the SANS have a course that teaches bypassing. So in 760, which is one of the courses I write, it's we do go through getting around some of the mitigations. We don't talk about all of them, of course, but especially the most common ones you'll see out there. The advanced pen test and exploit writing courses do cover those, like 660 and 760 for sure. Yeah, and Alex, I'm happy to hear that because believe me, I really wanted to spend like 10 minutes on the topic of virtualization-based security because it's so fascinating. So I don't see any other questions coming in. Wait, is there something else? Let me see here. I thought I might have saw something. Yes. If third parties want to develop mitigation solutions for kernel exploits, is there an API or SDK for doing it? So it's hard. There are companies out there that try and do like 0-day patching and such, but with mitigations like PatchGuard and others and HVCI for code integrity checks, it's really hard to make any changes like that because the operating system, if it's enforcing those protections, will throw an exception because it will see your code as bad. So it is really hard. And for a lot of the mitigations, developers actually need to know how to work with the APIs to take advantage of the mitigations. So not only do the defenders and administrators need to know how the mitigation works, developers might even need to make sure they code their applications to call the correct APIs and such. Thanks, Larry. All right, that is everything I see. Thank you. Cool. All right. Well, I guess that's a wrap. We'll finish it up there. I'm on Twitter at Steven Sims. It's at the very first slide. I'll jump back to the first slide real quick. Right there. You can DM me as well if you have questions. My DMs are open. Happy to answer them. But otherwise, have a great day. Have a great rest of your week, and I appreciate you joining me here.